Times and Seasons, a program dealing with significant issues of public concern.
Over 250 million people live in the United States. Some of the finest medical research and healthcare known to man is located here. But still there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who suffer and die unnecessarily every year. Hello, I'm Arnold Augustin. On this edition of Times and Seasons, we'll discuss tobacco use, not only in America, but other countries as well. We'll explore the origins of modern tobacco use, how and why it's used, how it affects the body, and how we together can virtually eliminate all the misery and death it causes. When Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, he and his crew also discovered tobacco. They observed the Carib Indians in Cuba using tobacco in a mostly ceremonial way, by smoking it, and also using finely powdered tobacco as snuff. It first became popular in Europe, mostly for its supposed curative powers, and by the early 17th century, the smoking of tobacco was almost worldwide. But even then, there were many who suspected the dangerous effects it would have on man, and its use was prohibited by many rulers of the lands to which it was brought. In 1604, for example, England's King James I characterized smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. He then promptly raised the import duty on tobacco by 4,000%. Turkish Sultan Murad IV, though, was considerably less tolerant. He reportedly executed up to 18 smokers a day. But despite these and some other rather severe measures, the use of tobacco continued to grow and took a huge leap forward with the invention in 1880 of a machine which could mass-produce cigarettes. Today, tobacco is a multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry, and the use of tobacco continues to be the leading cause of preventable death on this planet.
The fight against tobacco use is still the #1 public health problem in the United States if you talk about the people affected. AIDS has taken our attention because of its great potential for death, but think of it this way: all of the patients that have been diagnosed since 1981 with AIDS equals the number that die every month from tobacco.
One of the major problem areas we've still got is the still increasing incidence of smoking amongst teenage girls. And that has to be turned around, else we will have a major problem there. In fact, we've now, just within the last year, found that the curve for lung cancer deaths in Canadian women has now crossed that for breast cancer, so that lung cancer is now killing more Canadian women than breast cancer has done in the past, and that's tobacco related. So we're reaping the harvest of women smoking now, just as we began to reap the harvest of men smoking several decades ago.
It's our most serious preventable cause of illness, disability and premature death in this country. And it's been so, really, since we first discovered it, which was in the early 60s, when the Royal College of Physicians produced its first report on smoking and health.
Well, it's the most important cause of avoidable death in Australia. If you want a comparison, in this state of Victoria, with 4 million people, 17 people die every day from tobacco-associated disease, heart disease, lung cancer, etc. 7 people die every day from alcohol-associated disease, and less than 1 person dies every day from the use of hard drugs. So tobacco is a very high priority.
A high priority indeed. In the United States alone, 350,000 people suffer and die prematurely every year from diseases caused by tobacco use. That's the equivalent of a collision with no survivors of 2 jumbo jets every day. And the figures are equally shocking in other Western cultures. In Canada, with a population of 25 million, 32,000 people a year are killed by tobacco. The United Kingdom loses at least 100,000 of its citizens every year because of tobacco. And in Australia, with only 16 million people in the entire country, 33,000 die every year from the effects of tobacco use.
It's amazing how, to me at least, how after all these years of educational efforts, there are still a lot of people who don't seem to know how much they put themselves at risk when they smoke.
There are many other scientists who agree with Morrison, such as Dr. Ronald Davis, director of the U.S. Office on Smoking and Health.
There's probably a general understanding on the part of the public that this is a dangerous thing to do, but I don't think the public really fully comprehends how dangerous a habit cigarette smoking is.
For several decades now, scientists from every corner of the globe have warned of the deadly consequences of tobacco use. One of the earliest researchers on the relationship of tobacco use and lung cancer was Dr. Ernst Winder, now president of the American Health Foundation. Dr. Winder began his investigation in the late 1940s.
Well, we have learned that tobacco smoke and tobacco itself is carcinogenic to a variety of human tissues and organs, lung, larynx, oral cavity, mouth, bladder, pancreas. We have learned that tobacco use causes about 1/3 of all male cancer deaths in this country.
In Canada, at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, Dr. Andrew Pipe deals on a daily basis with the effects of tobacco smoke on the human body.
There are at least 4,000 distinct chemical compounds in tobacco smoke, at least 50 of which we know cause cancer. But so many of the other effects are perhaps not as well understood by the general public. Insofar as the heart is concerned, for instance, nicotine causes your blood pressure to increase, it causes your heart rate to increase. As a consequence, the heart has to work harder doing what it does. As a consequence, its demands for fuel are much greater. In the heart's case, fuel is oxygen, which is delivered by the bloodstream. But carbon monoxide, which comes in the tobacco smoke, kicks off oxygen from something we call hemoglobin, and therefore the fuel, or rather the bloodstream, does not contain as much fuel. So that when a smoker takes a cigarette or drags on his or her cigarette, he increases his heart rate, increases his blood pressure. It's kind of like stepping on the gas. At the same time, he decreases the amount of oxygen available to the heart. That's like stepping on the brake at the same time, and we all know what that does to automatic transmissions. Nicotine as well tends to sensitize the heart muscle, and make it much more susceptible to suddenly go into an unusual heart rhythm, what we call ventricular fibrillation, so that the highest rate of sudden cardiac death that occurs when this fibrillation occurs in smokers, and smokers are many times more likely to be at risk for this form of cardiac death than are non-smokers.
Many people don't know that smokers are also at considerable risk of losing much of their hearing, and that vision is also affected by smoking. Indeed, as one researcher put it, it's almost impossible to find any part of the body that's not affected. And in the case of smoking in women, the risks are greatly compounded. Dr. Elizabeth Whalen, scientist and author, is the executive director of the American Council on Science and Health.
Of course, women have a number of unique additional risks they must look at. One obviously involves childbearing. At every aspect of the childbearing sequence, attempting to become pregnant, attempting to stay pregnant, to have a healthy child, and to have a child that survives the first few months of life. At every single one of those phases, cigarette smokers put their babies at risk. Women who smoke have more difficulty becoming pregnant. They have a higher miscarriage rate. They have a lower birth weight babies. They have a higher percentage of sudden infant death syndrome after the child is born. Women have that. They have the problem of use of the oral contraceptive, which is like we call a heart attack waiting to happen, or a stroke, when you begin mixing the oral contraceptive with smoking. So there's some unique facets that make smoking even more hazardous for women.
Another area of major concern today is the effect tobacco smoke has on the non-smoker in a smoke-filled environment. Once again, Canadian physician Dr. Andrew Pipe.
First of all, I think it's important to understand that the temperature of a cigarette that's lying there idling in an ashtray is much lower than the temperature at the end of the cigarette when somebody takes a drag on it. As a consequence, the combustion of the tobacco products is far less complete, and the smoke therefore contains far more impurities and chemical byproducts of incomplete combustion, and so in some respects is more hazardous than the smoke which a smoker draws into his or her lungs. We know that you and I, or anyone else who's in a smoky environment, draws these materials into our lungs. And you can, depending upon your workplace, go home every day with levels of nicotine and other compounds in your blood, in your urine, in your sweat, in your saliva, in your breast milk, if you're a breastfeeding mother, that approximate smoking between 2 and 11 cigarettes a day. And so it stands to reason that there will, over time, be an effect of this kind of exposure. And in the last few years, we're beginning to understand the rather unfortunate consequences of living with a smoker. We know that the incidence of lung cancer in non-smoking wives living with smoking husbands is much greater than that of non-smoking wives living with non-smoking husbands. We know that the incidence of respiratory disease, bronchitis, emphysema, bronchitis, pneumonia, middle ear infections in young children is much higher if they live in a home where one or both parents smoke, and those children will have a much higher incidence of admission to hospital emergency wards in their first years of life, for instance. So that there are very clear repercussions to a non-smoking individual that occur as a consequence of his exposure to other people's tobacco smoke.
There are literally thousands of tragic stories that could be told about the effects of tobacco use in all its forms, about the anguish it causes those who watch their loved ones suffer and die, and about the enormous dollar costs to families, business, and government. There are, however, some social groups which have been able to avoid many of those tragic consequences because of their long-standing policies against tobacco use.
And in fact, the cancer epidemiologists have put a good deal of time in looking for and then examining groups which, for various reasons, sometimes religious, sometimes not, just abstain from tobacco use. There have been, in particular, two groups that have been looked at quite extensively. The members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and the Seventh-day Adventists. And both of them show markedly less tobacco-related cancer deaths than the general population.
When all this is considered, and when people know and understand the tremendous risks, many have a very difficult time understanding why anybody would use tobacco. But there is one major reason. Tobacco contains a very powerful drug.
I think for a long time we tended to place all the responsibility for tobacco addiction on the smoker, and in that sense viewed them as villains. And I think only now are we beginning to be more sensitive and understand that in many respects smokers are victims. They are victims of an addictive process to perhaps one of the most highly addictive drugs that we know of. And they require some sympathy and some understanding, not vilification.
In fact, most experts in the field consider the nicotine in tobacco to be the most addictive drug we have. And as a form of drug taking, smoking is by far the most efficient. When smoke is inhaled, it takes just 7 seconds for nicotine to reach the brain. In 30 seconds, it has gone completely through the body. Not even the so-called mainline drug taking in the vein is that efficient. Those same authorities say as few as 2 cigarettes are enough to set up the addictive cycle in some people. Roberta Ference is a scientist at the Addiction Research Foundation in Toronto, Canada.
Yeah, we find that people certainly are addicted to tobacco, to smoking. In fact, there's some evidence that the physical addiction is as strong as it is to some fairly potent drugs. We find that people who want a cigarette within half an hour after awaking, these people are probably quite physically addicted to smoking. And even for those who aren't, there's a very strong psychological component. When people quit smoking, the first month or so you go through physical withdrawal and you experience a number of side effects such as irritability or trouble sleeping or trouble concentrating. But after that time, any feelings that desire you have for a cigarette or problems that you're having are due to the psychological habituation to smoking. And this can go on for months or even years. It's a very powerful psychological addiction as well.
When we think of smokers, we usually think of the adult smoker. But Dr. Kenneth Warner's main concern is with the young. Warner is professor and chair of the Department of Public Health Policy and Administration of the University of Michigan. He's published widely on the subject of smoking and health.
It's really critical to understand that smoking is not an adult custom as it is portrayed by the tobacco industry. It is an addiction. It is an addiction that the former director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse characterizes as the most widespread form of drug dependency in this country. and it's one that is acquired in the early teenage years. 90% of everyone who ever smokes starts the habit before the age of 20. 60% start the habit before the age of 14 or 15. So we're talking about a very addictive behavior that is initiated in the childhood years, in effect.
Cigarette companies deny the $2 billion a year they spend on advertising worldwide is aimed at attracting new young smokers. Instead, they claim, they only want to keep the smokers they've got. But that argument has very little credibility outside the tobacco industry.
The tobacco industry is perhaps most adamant in protesting the notion that they are advertising their products to kids, that they're going after kids. But there's a simple fact of life. If they don't get the kids, they don't have a market. If 90% of all smokers start before they're out of their teens, and 60% of them start before they reach the age of 14 or 15, if you don't get that group at that age, you're never going to get them. You can also run through some simple arithmetic. It's kind of interesting. This product loses more of its consumers than any other product every single year. Now, why is that? Well, for one thing, they're killing 300,000 of their consumers, many more than any other product, many more than almost all other products put together. Secondly, an average of about 1 to 1.5 million people have been quitting every single year since the Surgeon General's report in 1964. When you add those two together, that means you've got something in excess of 2 million consumers being lost out of about 56 million every year. Now, to extend the arithmetic a little further, if 90% of all new smokers start before the age of 20, and you're trying to replace over 2 million smokers every single year, this means that in excess of 5,000 children have to start smoking every single day of every single year simply to maintain the number of smokers out there. That's one very powerful incentive for the industry to do everything it can to get kids to use its products.
The tobacco industry is powerful. It has a lot of money, and it's spending a lot of money in order to stay in business.
They are probably the strongest industry in the United States today. They're strong in the sense that they're very, very wealthy. They sell a product that is very profitable. But even more important, they are now expanding in a way, acquiring more and more parts of corporate America. And with every acquisition, their clutch on American economy and the American people is furthered.
Well, first, when you ask that question, you have to understand what the tobacco industry is. Because right now, the tobacco industry is cookies and candies and dog food and cat food and you name it. Because the tobacco industry consists of companies which are conglomerates in the biggest possible way. As of 1984, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris were primarily tobacco companies. In 1985, R.J. Reynolds bought Nabisco, and that was shortly thereafter followed by Philip Morris acquiring General Foods. The latter was the largest non-oil company merger in history at that point, so that Smurfberry Crunch cereal is made by the tobacco companies, as is Alpo dog food and several other products of that nature.
And what that really means is that the tobacco industry can make it very uncomfortable for media that refuse to advertise their tobacco products.
There was one magazine in this country that decided to get rid of all of its smoking advertisements. Well, obviously their income fell dramatically. They then hired an advertising procurement agency, and they came back in about 3 months and said, we don't think it's possible. The reason was that the word was out, don't advertise any of our products in this magazine.
On the plus side, one of the major reasons the tobacco industry is getting into other businesses is because it's rapidly losing ground in the United States and in other Western cultures as well.
In a developed world, tobacco is on its way out. It's going slowly, it's going kicking and screaming, and it'll be with us for a lot of years, but it's going.
If you look at cigarette sales in the United States, they've been declining by about 1% per year for the last several years. That trend will continue, there's no doubt about it. By any index, the cigarette industry is in trouble.
But this optimism about the steady decline of tobacco use in developed countries is no cause for celebration. In fact, there's a tremendous concern now about the flood of tobacco into a very vulnerable new market.
And in a way, as we in Britain, America, Australia, Canada, other developed countries, as we push smoking down, we're helping, I'm afraid, to export the problem to countries in the third world, which just have no idea what's coming to them, I'm afraid. No idea at all.
You now see more and more use of tobacco by young adults, particularly, in developing nations, of West Africa, for example, of Southeast Asia, for example. And what this amounts to is not just the use of tobacco as we know it here, but the use of very potent forms of tobacco, very high tar and nicotine cigarettes, for example, much, much higher than we would ever see on the market in Canada, for example.
In Canberra, Bernie McKay heads up the Australian Health Department.
With my connections with the World Health Organization, the concerns that are now being expressed at that level about tobacco development in developing countries, where in fact it's replacing what one would see as essential food crops, that those countries are now growing tobacco, and tobacco usage amongst the populations is increasing. And I think that's a very worrying thing.
I know, I've talked to ministers of health of third world countries. They agree with everything that I do about both smoking and smokeless tobacco, but put yourself in the position of the Minister of Finance of a third world country, a ready cash crop, the source of an excise tax. All those things are very enticing now, but they can't possibly make up for the health costs 20 years down the road.
And now the result of that will unquestionably be, as the World Health Organization has pointed out, a major epidemic of cancer-related cancer that is related to tobacco use. 20 years from now, we'll get a tremendous epidemic of lung cancer. We'll have a lot of tobacco-related heart disease, all resulting from this growing use of tobacco by young adults, particularly in third world countries.
It's the most scandalous avoidable health holocaust of this century, without any doubt.
There are many ways of attacking the tobacco problem. Television spots, for example, like this one made for the American Cancer Society, have had a very positive, though limited, response.
Simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer. I'm convinced of that.
And this sensitive spot was produced for the United Kingdom Health Education Authority.
Hello, darling.
I knew it was you.
What's that you're reading, Kat? Tell her.
If you won't give up smoking for yourself, do it for your kids.
The tobacco industry is massive and wields enormous monetary power. But all the experts agree that in the end, the tobacco industry will lose out as people learn the facts.
The tactic that they fear most is truth, that tobacco is dangerous, that it causes cancer, heart disease, chronic obstructive lung disease. The thing that they fear more than anything else is the knowledge of the people of this country that nicotine, which is contained in tobacco, is an addictive drug. And it's the most addictive drug in our society.
We stick to solid scientific facts and figures. They're worried about that, and they do their level best, of course, to confuse people, to tell lies, to change the agenda, to try and dismiss anyone from the health profession, even the entire medical profession at one blow, as some tiny minority of fanatics.
In London, Pam Taylor is spokeswoman for the prestigious British Medical Association.
What the tobacco industry seems to fear most is that the BMA has got stuck in and is going to stay here. And what they've tried to do unsuccessfully is to divert us away from what it is that we want to achieve. They try and push us into other areas of activity with opinion polls saying the BMA should be doing this rather than smoking and so on, as if 100,000 deaths, that's 270 a day, shouldn't be our major objective. So obviously they're worried. They're worried that we're getting involved internationally as well, because they're multinational, so why shouldn't we fight them on a multinational basis? So yes, they try, but they're really not going to win, and they know it, and I think that's what worries them.
And there are many things you can do to keep the pressure on, to help stop the needless suffering and death caused by the use of tobacco.
The greatest weapon that we have against smoking is the militant non-smoker. He's the person that carries the cudgel. He goes out and rings the doorbells. He takes part with the American Lung, American Heart, American Cancer Society. He goes to schools. He talks to kids. And I think it's much better to keep a youngster from starting than it is to try to get him to quit after he's become addicted.
Political channels, people make the politicians. So until the community says we've had enough of tobacco, our politicians, that's only when our politicians will really hear. And we think that the campaigns that have been running in this country now for the last 10 years, which have given large media exposure to the problems of tobacco, that the community is now starting to understand what a problem it is and starting to demand action from their politicians, and we think that's the way to go.
Oh, there's a lot that you can do. And the first thing is don't smoke yourself. If you don't want your kids to smoke, then don't smoke yourself. The best example starts at home. Parents who smoke are much, much more liable to have children who smoke. There are lots of studies which show that to be true. If you don't smoke and if you don't encourage smoking in your home, and if you set the proper example, the chances are that your children will not smoke. You need to talk about that in families. You need to talk about the health hazards. You need to make very certain that your children are fully aware of what the health hazards are that are related to smoking.
Perhaps where the greatest effectiveness can come are from workers demanding that their work site become smoke-free. They're entitled to that because of the dangers of passive smoking, but the neat thing about the work site is that you hit a lot of people at one time, and you not only protect the non-smoker from passive smoke, but if you are in an environment where other people aren't smoking, it's easier to quit yourself. And if you have somebody at home dinging at you and saying, why don't you stop smoking, and you go to work and you can't smoke there either, you know, you finally say, okay, I succumb, I'm going to quit.
In the final analysis, it's up to us, to all of us. We must help each other if we're going to conquer this deadly tobacco plague.
Just to put it into perspective, cigarettes alone annually kill more people than the sum total of all of the deaths attributable to AIDS, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, fires, automobile accidents, homicides, and suicides.
But I think in the very best possible way, we've got to make ordinary citizens realize that the tobacco problem won't go away, governments have failed, until they themselves, each and every one of them, does something about it.
The program you have just seen is part of a series of programs dealing with significant issues of public concern. Times and Seasons is a production of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.